You're listening to the Author Stories Podcast, bringing you the story behind the stories and the storytellers.
Margaret White,
Terry Brooks,
Sheena Kamal,
Matthew Quick,
JT Ellison,
Walt D. Williams,
Brad Ford,
Corey Dr. O,
Brandon Sanderson,
Robin Mock,
Ernest Klein, Jim Butcher,
Shirley Harris.
Visit hankgarner.com for archives of all the shows. Today's guest is...
Well, thanks for joining me again for the Author Stories Podcast, where I bring you the story behind the stories and the storytellers. Today, I'm really excited to have Sarah Langan on the show with me today. She has an amazing new book. It's called Good Neighbors, and this is a must-have for your, winter leading into spring reading. This needs to be on your bedside table, and one of those books that you don't want to go to sleep at night for many good reasons as you read it. Welcome to the show, Sarah.
Oh, hey, thanks for having me. I'm really glad to be here.
I'm excited to have you. Sarah, we begin each show with the same question, and that question is, what is your first memory of wanting to be a writer or storyteller?
Oh, this is it's such a cliche. I think I was, my family went on a vacation to Moosehead Lake, Maine, and I was 4 years old, and it's like a freshwater lake, and it's beautiful, and there's these giant rocks we went climbing on, and I sat by myself on the rocks and looked at this beautiful lake and decided I wanted to be a writer. It sounds made up, but it's true.
That's not a cliche at all. That's a moment of inspiration.
Yeah, it's a fond memory.
Were you a bookish kid? Did you read a lot?
I was. I don't think I read. There were some kids who were a lot more bookish than I was, but probably at least a book a week. I was. And then when I would fall in love with a book, I would read it 10 times. I was like a fan.
Right. Do you remember? Were there any standout things from a particular book or an author or a series that really connected with you?
When I was a kid, there was Dory the Witch. Was like an early reader book written in the 1960s about this little girl who was a witch, and her mother was a witch, and she came from a coven of witches. And I love these stories, and I think I read all of them, and I got them from my daughters, and they're great. And then as I got older, Ray Bradbury really hit it for me. I remember reading Fahrenheit 451 when I was in, I think, 9th grade. And then I didn't go to bed. I just sat all night. And I remember my father coming down to get a snack and being like, "What is happening?" And I was like, "Did you know?"
I'm planning my revolt against the man. That's what I'm doing.
It's like, do you know what's happening now? That's the thing. And to his credit, he sat down with me and was like, let's talk about your existential crisis. So.
Good old Ray Bradbury. He seemed like such a nice guy to have given so many people crises.
Oh, but he's so hopeful. That's the thing about him. The reason you believe everything he writes is because it feels so true. And then he'll find that good thing about people and write about that.
Yeah. So speaking of Ray Bradbury, I'm glad you made that connection for me, because Bradbury was a huge proponent of writing short stories, and that people, his belief, and I have read this from him on multiple sources and occasions, was that people should begin by writing short stories and write a story every week for a year, because surely you can't write 52 bad stories. Eventually you'll strike upon something that's good. How did your writing life begin? Were you did you prescribe to Bradbury's thoughts on short stories, or
Yeah, I love short stories. Those are what I definitely started with. But I've always had an instinct toward a longer form.
Yeah.
So even when I write short stories, I think I could make that a novel. But yeah, I think particularly in craft, short stories make a lot more sense than novels because they are a microcosm. You are figuring out, even if it's just a short story, and I don't mean just a short story, you still have to have a character arc and you have to have a plot. So learning to do that without having to get lost in 300 pages and exhausting yourself makes a lot of sense for a starting out writer.
Right. So from that moment when you were a kid and staring at the water and just having this epiphany that you would be a writer, to you publishing your first book, was this a clear path from that moment forward, or were you like a lot of us who have these dreams and desires, but the little thing called life gets in the way, and there's paying bills and raising family and all of that stuff? Where did the writing career come back to you?
Well, I always knew that's what I wanted, but I mean, it seemed so pie in the sky that I never even told people other than my dad and my mom, because, you would say that and people would say, that's nice. You should be a theater critic. And you'd be like, well, that's not the same as, it's a good job, but it's not the same as what I want to be. So I never told anybody, but the reason I picked the college I picked was because it had a degree in creative writing, and I specifically wanted to do that. But even in college, it was so competitive to get into that program that I had to really fight to get in, and everybody wanted it. And you couldn't even say, even the undergraduates who were majoring in creative writing, none of us were saying, I want to be a writer, because it was too momentous. And also because people tended to say that's never going to happen for you. So then I went to grad school right after I got the degree in creative writing, and I was not a star in that program. There's always favorites, and I was never one of them. So, happily, I had very supportive parents. I mean, they just always thought, well, if you really want to have this happen, stop complaining about it and just do it. And who cares if people think you're not as good? Like, everybody's always, there's always going to be better people than you. So don't worry about it. So then I went to grad school for creative writing. And at that point, everyone was saying they wanted to be writers. And that was, overwhelming too. And I think I graduated I guess I was 22 or 20 now, maybe 23 when I graduated. I was working on my first novel, The Keeper, then. And, and then I just was working day jobs and things. And I never, after that, said I wanted to be anything other than a writer. I worked nights, I worked weekends, I did everything that I could. And I still didn't get that book published until I was 30. So it took 9 years.
Oh, was that book The Missing?
That was The Keeper.
The Keeper.
First, yeah. And then The Missing was just part of they said, write another one in a year. I said, okay.
I've already done this. Why not?
Yeah.
What was, was The Keeper the first book that you had written?
Yes.
That's interesting, because a lot of people will write that first novel. It doesn't find an audience, and they'll move on and, try again. And then, they wind up with these novels that become desk drawer novels or trunk novels or whatever we call them. What was it about this book that you believed in, that kept you, revising it or, trying other outlets? Or what was it about this story that was special to you? I
just felt passionate. I'm trying to think. It's a really good question, and no one's ever asked me that before. And I know that in my personality, I'm just not someone who's able to move on from things. It would be smart. There's so many times in my life that if I had walked away and said, I'll just write another book that'll take me 6 months, and then it'll be fine, and it's what everybody wants, and I can make a living. Instead, I would say, no, I'll get this right. And I think that's just part of my personality, and it's often to my detriment and sometimes good. But the thing about that story was I felt it's very much an underdog story and very much a story that people shied away from because it was so dark. And I think being in my 20s, there's never another time in your life when you're going to force people to listen to your story that's horrible because you're pissed off. And I think if I was, I would never have let that go at that age. At this age, I'd say, you know what? I don't need to upset people. I can move on and do something different because I have more, I'm more mature and more aware of other people's feelings and things. But, you know, that fire in my belly of my 20s, that was part of it, where I thought, I don't want to tell another story. This is the story. This is a good story. Someone better take it, and I'll find a way. So,
do you remember the first inspiration for The Keeper? What that first kernel of an idea was?
So I went to college in a town called Waterville, Maine, and it was a former paper mill town, and you can see the paper mill, and it wasn't running anymore, but it was sort of that decaying New England going on. And then there were a lot of town versus gown relations that were not great. And I lived off campus my senior year, and I just noticed a lot of frustration from the actual townspeople, and they had a lot of resentments, probably a lot of which were legitimate. And I was just curious about that, and I was curious about what it's like to live in a place where everybody else seems to be moving forward and you're not. And so I wrote from that perspective.
And that book came out, was it about 2009 when that book was released?
I think it was earlier. I think it was 2007.
Okay.
Maybe. Yeah.
So from there, you followed up. You have a couple of other novels, The Missing and Audrey's Door. Your new book, Good Neighbors, takes a bit of a tonal shift from your previous work to this one. First off, how would you describe your earlier work, and what would you say is different about Good Neighbors from the work that you had done prior?
Well, I think my earlier work was clearly horror and had supernatural things happening in it. And I think the convention that I used was sort of cathartic slasher endings, which is just part of the very fun convention of horror. And for Good Neighbors, I just didn't feel the need to incorporate anything supernatural into the story. It's a thriller, and it's about human relationships. And the most specific human relationship that it's about is these two mothers and a misunderstanding that they have between each other. That's the impetus for everything that happens afterward. And that to me was really important and personal, and didn't need any bells and whistles. And that's not to knock horror, because I love horror, but in horror, you sort of use the monster to represent something. And I didn't need any representations because I was just talking about what's happening in this relationship. And then as a microcosm of sort of the way we all seem to not be getting along as well as we should in this country.
Where does your love of horror come from?
I think I really like to think about why bad things happen. And horror asks that question. It asks that specific question. And a lot of other genres don't. But also, I think I just grew up at the heyday of horror. So when I was reading Stephen King and John Saul when I was 10 and 11 and 12, that had a huge impact on me. I think that's my whole generation. You probably loved Stephen King as a kid too.
Absolutely.
Dream Author by Sophie Hannah is an immersive 14-month coaching program for writers at any and every level of experience, and also for those of you who want to write and are just waiting for the right encouragement and guidance to get you started. Your writing dreams should make you happy. For so many of us, our dreams are not a source of happiness. Instead, they cause us stress, guilt, frustration, and even shame. Here's the great news. All of these feelings are natural and all writers experience them. The problem, though, is that when your writing dreams bring you more anxiety than joy, it affects your resolve and your productivity, and you end up not taking the action you need to take in order to propel your dreams in the right direction so that they can stand a strong chance of coming true. That's why Sophie created the Dream Author Coaching Program, to teach anyone who is passionate about writing how to change the way they build, think about, and pursue their writing dreams in order to become their own most powerful ally and advocate for the rest of their writing life. And more great news. Once you've learned that skill, it lasts forever. Visit dreamauthorcoaching.com to get started today. Authors, if you're looking for a partner to help ensure that your book is the best it can possibly be, look no further than Pico's House. Crystal and her staff make a conscious effort to be critical yet courteous. They also strive to make the business side of things run smoothly so that you can rest easy knowing that your manuscript is in capable hands. Whether you need beta reading, developmental editing, a manuscript critique, line editing, copy editing, or proofreading, Pico's House is the one-stop shop for you. Check them out today at picoshouse.com to get started. You talked about this tonal shift that happened in Good Neighbors, and realizing that you didn't need bells and whistles. You didn't need there to be a story behind the story, or a power behind the thing that's happening, which happens a lot in horror, especially supernatural horror. We're wrestling with things we can't explain, and there's another motivation behind people's actions a lot of times. In Good Neighbors, the motivations behind the things that are happening are almost scarier than horror in a way, because you can't point to another entity or another power behind it. This is just human nature gone awry, and sometimes that's even more scary when people act out just because they're people.
Yeah, I think that's true. It was honestly a much harder book to write, because my instincts are when I don't know what to do, I throw in a monster, and the monster and everybody, and it's fun, and this story, it wasn't just like I had the characters initially being more archetypal and being more cliched, because that's so much easier. But as I wanted to make a better book and kept revising it, what I found was that all of these characters are really sympathetic to me. And it's when things go wrong, it's tragic because they could have gone right. And it's very human, the story. And humans are not bad. I think humans are inherently good. But I think sometimes our better natures can get hijacked by our fears and our need to protect the people we love.
The Constantine sisters said that this is like a modern day Crucible. What do you think about comparisons like that?
I love it. I hoped someone would compare it to the Crucible. And I was like, thank you. Yeah, it feels like that. It feels like the world is in a tough place right now. We do have something existential happening, and it's global warming. And it's very easy to want to say, well, is it something supernatural? What's making the world like this? Who do we blame for it? It's just much easier to do that than have to realize we all have to, I don't know, we really have to work together to solve these problems.
The setting of Good Neighbors, Maple Street, is sort of an idyllic setting that we all can relate to in one way or another. What was it about this setting that sparked your imagination?
Oh, so I grew up in a town called Garden City on Long Island, and this isn't the Garden City I grew up in. It's obviously different, but I have really warm feelings about the suburbs and where I grew up, which may be surprising given I set something, a thriller there. But what I loved about where I grew up was we all knew each other. We all knew each other from kindergarten, and we all knew each other's stories, and we all had compassion for each other. In middle school notwithstanding. And I think coming from someplace I'm really lucky. And I think I'm naturally drawn to suburban stories because it's what I know so well. And I have so many fond memories of like my best friend Kate and I riding our bike to the pool every day and, walking to my friend's house. And then when I was older and would be visiting my parents in my 20s, I'd still meet all my friends and we'd go to the pub and we'd walk home because it was such a safe place to live. But things can go wrong when people know each other that well.
Right.
And things can go wrong with strangers. And people perceived as different. And where I grew up and the way I grew up in the 1980s, it was homogenous and you could not be different. And I was different. And I think that was hard on me. And I think it was hard on anyone who wasn't able to hide their difference since we're all different. And that has always stuck with me too. This feeling of being an outsider in a place that I love and also belong.
In this idyllic setting of Maple Street, we meet the Wilde family, and Wilde with an E, as in their last name Wilde, who are a bit of like oil and water for this setting. And the dad Arlo, one great description I read about him was he was a washed up rock star, but the only thing he had to show for it were track marks. That tells us so much about this character and this family, and the juxtaposition of them in this setting, is bound to make sparks fly. How did the Wilde family come to you?
As you mentioned that, I thought there was a kid who came from Brooklyn and transferred in ninth grade to my hometown, and he had an accent, and he like openly drank. and
he like, was okay,
like, this is trashy.
Right.
And I liked him. He was so outgoing, but it was shocking and it was obvious and everyone knew who he was. And so I think there's that. But I also think my family, my husband and I moved to Brooklyn, and not just Brooklyn, Crown Heights, and we loved it. And we knew everyone on our block, and it was like Sesame Street, and everybody was different. And it was exactly where we belonged. And then our kids got older and it was not a safe place for them. And the public school was not right for them. And we moved to Los Angeles, and we moved to a suburb of Los Angeles called Laurel Canyon that feels very much like the suburbs. And I'm so out of practice with even pretending that I'm socially appropriate that we got here and we were just fish out of water. And, we found our way, but it was comic, it was just comic. I'm like outgoing, and sometimes I put on more of an accent that I actually have because I don't know, it just happens. And that did not fly here. So, I had to learn some things, and it was really lonely. And having moved, I didn't realize that moving was lonely because I never really had to do it before. I grew up in my hometown. I never left it. And then, my parents were nearby when I lived in Brooklyn, and I knew everyone there. I'd made these slow earned friends over decades. We got here, I knew no one. And it was one of the hardest things that I've ever had to do. The feeling of isolation, and when you pick up your kids and your kids haven't made any friends and you haven't made any friends, and it's a long weekend and you see everyone going to go do all the things that they're inviting each other to, and you're not in on it, it feels awful. So I think I was thinking of that too.
It feels a lot in this book like when you are driving down the road and you can see in the distance there's a train coming and you see traffic over here, and you just know in your heart something bad is about to happen, and you can see it, but you're not close enough to do anything about it. But you just know that this is going to be sparks are going to fly, and you get that feeling in reading this when the Wilds move in and you start, they share too much too soon, and you're like, oh man, I feel what's going to happen. As you started writing this and you kind of felt the tensions rising, and you knew that the cast of characters you had created, did you know where the story was going to go? And, how did you, as you kind of put yourself in the tension of the situation, did you understand how the characters were going to react?
I knew how I wanted it to end. And I wrote that opening. And my plan was for it to go in that direction. So the problem for me was figuring out what combination of personalities would make that happen. So I really, the hardest character I had to work on was the way that Rhea and Gertie bounced off of each other.
Yeah.
Because I wanted it to be something where it would have made perfect sense if they had actually become best friends. And it's something sad that they don't, because you can see the ways that they really could have been good for each other. But it also, I wanted it to be, and I had to keep working and researching narcissistic personality disorder. And I researched Kitty Genevieve's, that story?
Yeah.
Yeah. So briefly, in the 70s, New York was supposed to be a terrible crime place. And in a story of this woman, Kitty Genevieve, was screaming outside her building while being murdered by her boyfriend, and no one helped her. That's what everyone said happened. But then I researched, and I thought, maybe I have things that I could, when researching mob mentality, I could really look at this and borrow from it, these real life examples. But every time I researched these real life examples, I debunked them. I would find out, oh no, Kitty Genevieve died in her neighbor's arms. Her neighbors all called the police. The police lied about it because they didn't want to admit they hadn't shown up. And she had good neighbors. And the Stanford prison experiment, the same thing. That was just a totally bogus experiment. And this, we have this narrative that we're inherently bad people, or that we're not bad people, but the strangers are bad people. And given the opportunity, they're going to do something bad. But most of the time, that's not true. Most of the time, we are giving each other the benefit of the doubt. So what I really had to do was think about, well, what would move a community to turn on the Wild family? Not just there being strangers, but what else would do it? What kinds of gossip and rumors would make that happen? Who would spread them, and why? So,
in a lot of literature, you have a protagonist who is likable for whatever reason, but the the reader kind of hooks on to that reader, to that character, and we go through the story with them. What is it like to write a story where there's not one character who is a shining hero? Everyone has faults. How do you make likable characters in a situation where so much goes wrong?
I kind of resist the idea of the likable character, and it's because I think all characters are likable if you're writing them as honestly and truly as you can, so that they seem real. Because I think all people are likable. There's some side of them, especially if you know them, or you know their internal thoughts, or you know why they're acting the way that they are. And so I had that. And then also I love the wilds. And it's strange to me that acknowledging their imperfections might make them less likable as opposed to more human. There's the Jack Reacher school of writing where you would have like this amazing guy, who knows everything.
Right.
But I don't know where the room is for them to grow or be. So I feel like Gertie, her whole life, all she's wanted to do is be better and get better, and she works for it so hard. And when I have her make mistakes, I can feel her pain. I didn't even like writing when she made mistakes, and it wasn't because I was afraid people wouldn't like her. It was because I felt bad for her that she had to live with a mistake she made because it's awful. Right. And so I'm surprised when people say that they didn't find the wilds likable. I'm not really sure. I disagree with them. But Julia, I think Julia is a great character. And I actually think Shelley is a pretty good character too.
Absolutely. So. Well, Sarah, after having, really planted your tent stakes in horror and really made a name for yourself in that genre, then switching over and writing more of a thriller or a domestic thriller, however you want to categorize this book. Are you more comfortable in this new genre? Do you think in the future you might go back and forth, or how do you feel about the constraints of genre now?
So, yes, it was really hard to figure out how to do this, to write not in horror genre, to be telling the same kinds of stories, but without monsters. Right. And I feel like I've learned that. And so I'm going to keep doing it because, I like using the skills. But the idea of genre constraint, what I'm finding is that monsters aren't as interesting for me to write about as they used to be. And I like a more subtle story. And I think that's just where I am in the world right now. So I think you could still categorize what I do as horror. It's just less visceral. And the reason I'm less into the visceral is it just feels like it takes the reader out of the story, or maybe it takes me out of the story. If a monster shows up and somebody has to stab it, this isn't really happening. And we all know it's not really happening. So which is stupid. It used to drive me crazy. So I don't know how I've come around on this, because I would think to myself, but none of it's really happening. Why are they upset and saying monsters aren't real? They're afraid with stories. None of it's real. We've made it up. But I think I'm just, right now, what I'm interested in is making people think what I'm doing is as true to life as possible.
And what a fantastic job you've done with Good Neighbors. The book is available everywhere now when you're hearing this, in Kindle edition or hardcover or audiobook. However you like to consume books, you can grab Good Neighbors. Now there are show notes in the There's a link to the book in the show notes of this episode. I'm getting ahead of myself. Sarah, if people are just learning about you and want to dig into all the great stuff that you do, is there a place where they can connect with you online?
Oh, yeah. You can go to sarahlangan.com, SarahLangan.com, or I'm also on Twitter and Facebook and Instagram.
Excellent. We'll put links to all those in the show notes as well. Sarah, this has been so much fun chatting. I love Good Neighbors. We're going to send everyone to grab a copy of it. Thank you so much for taking time to come on the show today.
Oh, thank you for having me.
And we'll cut it right there. That was fantastic. Thank you.
Oh, great. Thank you. That was really nice. And thanks for the work you're doing and thanks for reading it.
Thank you. Thank you. I appreciate that. When we release this next week, we'll send you a link to it and we'll promote it everywhere.
That's awesome. I'm excited. I'm very nervous. It's been a long time since I had a book out.
It's going to be fantastic. People are going to love this book, I promise.
I hope so.
But thanks, Sarah. Let's stay in touch. I'd love to have you back sometime.
I would love to too. Thank you so much. Okay.
Have a great day.
You too.
Bye-bye.
Bye.